Maybe I'll just say a few words about who I am. So I, as Zoka said, I taught the sampling and estimation class here. I did I did work for 10 years as a survey statistician and methodologist in the U.S., and I've recently moved. I was on the slide here. I'm doing a Vertretungsstelle as a professor at the University of Mannheim, so I'm teaching there this year. And I also have a regular position, a more permanent position at the IAB. IAB is it's the research arm of the German Department of Labor, Department of Work. And that's going to be important in terms of understanding where some of the data that I'm using comes from. We have a very unique situation at IAB where we have a lot of we have access to a lot of administrative data and can compare survey answers to things that are as close to true values as you're ever going to get. And so that's in a nice situation where we can look at measurement error in ways that other organizations cannot. And so I'll be drawing on that sort of data in part in this presentation. So this, of course, is not work that I've done by myself, locked in a closet. This is work with Frauke Kreuter, who was my advisor when I did my PhD at the University of Maryland. Roger Tarangel, who was also at the University of Maryland and is now with Westat, which, like NORC, is one of these big data collection firms in the U.S. It was, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So Roger Tarangel is now with Westat. Annette Yekla is at the University of Essex, which is in England, obviously. And there are others as well that you'll see at the end that I name. And then I usually like to say, for those of you who don't know me, that I work in Germany and I live in Germany and I have a very German name, and so sometimes people get confused. But I am, in fact, an American. And to make it more complex, Annette Yekla is German and lives and works in England. So we've got sort of a nice international group here. And the whole presentation will be in English. My German is actually not that good, so don't start speaking German with me. So I'm talking today, as Zoka said, how does this work again? There we go. I'm talking today, as Zoka said, about measurement error, not about sampling or analysis or any of the stuff we did last week. And measurement error generally is when the answers you get in a survey are not the answers that you wanted, right? They don't match the true value in some sense for that respondent. And I'm talking today about 3 forms of measurement error, which I believe are related, and I hope I can convince you of that. One is error in screener interviews. I will explain what those are in a moment. If you don't know, just hold on. The next is filter questions, and I will also define those. And then the third is repeated questions in panel surveys. So when we ask the same questions wave after wave, do we get consistent answers? I think some of you are taking a class on panel surveys. Is that right? You're teaching a class on panel surveys. So you've perhaps heard quite a bit about these topics. And so what I'm first going to do is review existing research on each of these 3 areas rather briefly and set up what we know about the measurement error in each of these 3 instances and how they might be related. And then go through the experiments that we've done in Germany, in the US, and in the Netherlands to try to understand more deeply the sources and the causes of the measurement error in each of these situations. So let me first talk about screener interviews and the existing research here. So screener interviews are small, short interviews where you just ask if the person you're talking to is eligible for the survey. So for example, if you're doing a survey of women 15 to 49, your first question would be over the phone, is anyone there who lives there 15 to 49? If you're looking for families with young children, right? So that question, those questions that establish eligibility, that's what I'm calling a screener question. Now, in a lot of European countries, you can kind of select from the registers. You can select a survey that already only contains women ages 15 to 49. And so screening is a little bit less common, certainly in Germany, than in the US and maybe in other countries as well. But I think we can all get our minds around what screening is, even if you haven't done it yourself in your own surveys. So here's an example from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, NLSY. This is the cohort that was screened in 1997. And they were looking here for people ages 12 to 21. So they were going out, it was a face-to-face survey, they were going up to the door, knocking on the door, making contact, and looking for families that contained at least one person aged 12 to 21. And the question was very direct, is anyone in this household 12 to 21 years old? And there was also an advance letter sent out that said, we're doing a survey of youth, and we will be contacting you soon to participate in this survey. And so what did they find? This graph, it's not a pretty graph, but it nicely demonstrates what went wrong in this survey. So here we see ages from 0 to 32 on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we see the population numbers. And it's a little hard to see here. Maybe I can trace with my pointer. This top line here is, and then we kind of lose it over here. That's how many people we expected to find in each of these age ranges. And that comes from a very good US survey called the Current Population Survey. We get very good numbers from that. We think these numbers are quite good. These are the truth about how many people there should have been at these ages in 1997 when they did this screening. And then the black here is how many we find in the survey. And we didn't find millions in the survey. These are numbers that have been weighted up, right? But you can see there's a shortfall here. And where is it? It's exactly 12 to 21, right? Exactly where we're looking to find these kids. I wasn't working on the survey, but exactly where they were looking to find these kids, they didn't find them, right? We see pretty good coverage. Here, the survey numbers match what we expect. And we see a little bit of underreporting here in the younger age ranges, not too bad, but a big shortfall exactly where we were looking to find these kids. So that's what I mean by misreporting in these screener interviews. We went out and looked for a specific subpopulation, and we didn't find as many of them as we should have. And this problem, so this result here is from this Horrigan et al. Paper, and in that paper they suggest that what's going on is that households are lying. We show up, we knock on the door, we ask this very direct question, is anyone here eligible for our survey? And they say no, because they don't want to they don't want to say yes, and then, but I don't want to participate, go away, go away. It's a little bit less maybe rude to say, oh no, there's no one here who's in your age range, right? And so that's what I mean by motivated misreporting. That's kind of the theme of this presentation, right? So people are misanswering this question in an attempt to shorten the interview. That's what Horrigan et al. Say is the explanation going on here. But they didn't actually test it, right? They just say we have a shortfall, it's in exactly the age range we're looking for, and they suspect it's this motivated misreporting, but they haven't actually verified that, and that's what we're going to do. That's what I'm going to do today. This is not this is not a problem that's unique to NLSY. It's the best documented example of this, but every survey has this problem. I worked for years on the National Immunization Survey, which is a telephone survey of families with kids ages 18 to 36 months. This is a very small segment of the population. It's about 4.2% of the US population, I believe, and we never got eligibility rates over 3. You know, we're missing a lot of these families, right? So, and the National Survey of Family Growth has this sort of undercoverage problem. All sorts of surveys do. I don't mean to pick on NLSY. Okay, so those are screener interviews. Filter questions, what are those? Filter questions are similar to screener questions. They're used within a survey to establish eligibility for additional questions. For example, you'd want to ask, is anyone in your household full-time employed? No, I'm sorry, that would be a screener. So you're involved in, you're interviewing someone, and in the middle of the interview you might say, are you currently full-time employed? And if they say no, then you skip a bunch of questions, right? And if you say yes, then, oh, okay, well, how much do you currently earn in your job? How long have you been there? How do you get to work every day? What's your average commute time, right? These are questions that wouldn't make any sense to ask of someone who's not employed. And so that's what I mean by a filter question. It establishes eligibility for the follow-up questions within the middle of a survey. And so filter questions can be asked in 2 different ways. This shows the interleaved format. And so these questions are adapted from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, which is a survey done to estimate the inflation rate in the US. In the last 3 months, have you purchased pants? If you say no, we move on. In the last 3 months, have you purchased a jacket? But if you say yes to that first filter question, the pants question, in the last 3 months, have you purchased pants? Yes, I have. Oh, how much did those pants cost? Does that price include tax? Did you buy that item for yourself or for someone else? How satisfied are you with these pants? We wouldn't ask those questions, right, if you said no to the pants. So that's how filter questions work, and this is what the interleave format looks like. The follow-ups, those 4 questions about the pants, I'm going to call those follow-ups. They're stuck in the middle there. Filter, follow-ups, filter, follow-ups. This is what we call the interleaved format. The other format, as you probably anticipated, is the grouped format. We could ask all of the filters up front, all of those purchase questions. In the past 3 months, have you purchased pants? Have you purchased a jacket? Have you purchased shoes? If we say yes to that pants question, we're going to go through all the filters, and then to come back, okay, earlier you said that you had purchased some pants. Let's talk about those. How much do they cost? Does that price include tax? So you get the sense here of how these questions work in the grouped format as well. So several studies have compared the interleaved and the grouped format in the filter questions. Again, this is work that's been done. There are several studies that have done this. I've got one example here from a recent article by Kreuter, Müller, Presser, and Taranjo, where they showed, as all these studies find, that the grouped format collects more yes answers to the filter questions than the interleaved format. So if you think about those purchase questions, we get more yeses to pants and jackets and shoes when we asked in the group format than when we ask in the interleave format. It's a pretty well-known result. This graph comes from this Kreuter et al. Paper. So here are 7 purchase questions. The questions they used are very like those ones we just were looking at. And on the horizontal axis, this is the ratio of the number of yeses we get in the grouped format to the number we get in the interleave format. And so that should be 1, right? If the 2 formats are behaving the same way, that should be 1. And what do we see? It starts out right at 1. When we first start asking questions, the 2 formats are performing really similarly. But as we go through the section, the difference widens, and the grouped format here is getting more than twice as many yeses as the interleave format. So again here, the suggestion in the literature is that respondents in the interleave format catch on to the pattern and then start saying no because they want to reduce the burden of the survey, right? They say, oh, you know what, I could skip all these boring questions about my satisfaction with my purchases if I just say no. So that's the suggestion in the literature, but again, nobody has tested that. We don't know that that's really what's going on. Okay, the last motivating example here is about these repeated questions in panel surveys. So when we do panel surveys, we often want to measure change, and we do that by asking the same questions year after year after year. Like, how many hours per week do you work? Right? And when we do that, when we just ask that question again and again, we tend to get over-reports of change. The number of hours tends to jump around too much. In one wave it's 20, in another it's 25, and then it's 18, and we get too much change. That's a known result in the literature. So one of the things that people try to do to reduce the amount of change collected in surveys is use these dependent interviewing questions, where we feed in information from the previous wave. Last time we interviewed you, you said you were working about 25 hours per week. That's a fill-in from the previous wave, right? Is that still the case? And there have been some studies showing that dependent interviewing will reduce the amount of change that we collect and maybe give us better estimates of change over time, right? So it makes the results from wave to wave more stable. But then there's concern that it's doing that too well, right? And we get underreports of change from wave to wave. If somebody says, last time we spoke to you, you said you were working 25 hours a week, is that still the case? It might be very easy to just say, oh yeah, everything's the same, right? When in fact it's not. So we worry that we're not getting enough change when we do the dependent interviewing. So those are the three types of measurement error we're worried about: screener questions, filter questions, and these dependent interviewing questions. And in these three situations, we're worried that respondents may answer these questions in ways that reduce the burden of the interview. So in the screener question, in the screener situation, they'll make themselves ineligible because they just think that that's an easy way to get out of this uncomfortable interaction where someone's on the phone, you don't want to talk to them. They will avoid triggering the filter questions. They'll learn in the interlude format at least to lie and say, no, I'm not full-time employed. No, I have not purchased any shoes. And then in the dependent interviewing question, they'll just say, yeah, everything's the same. And they're doing this, the motivation, the mechanism that explains that behavior is this motivated underreporting or motivated misreporting, trying to reduce the burden of the questionnaire. That's one of the hypotheses about what we think is going on. It's also possible that it could be the interviewers, right? We hound, I'm sure in your country as well, certainly in the US and Germany, we hound our interviewers for high response rates. You know, how many cases did you complete last week? How many cases are you going to complete this week? We tend not to get upset about low eligibility rates. If they say, oh, I talked to those people and nobody in their household is eligible for the survey, we say, okay. We tend not to go after them about that, right? So interviewers, when they're talking to a family that is uncooperative, may choose to make that family ineligible rather than prolong the interaction. Right? Well, if I don't want to ask them if they've got teenagers in the household, then I'll have to talk to that teenager. Right? And he might be just as much of a jerk as his parents are on the phone. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea, right? So it may be interviewers that are causing this motivated underreporting, and in addition to or instead of the respondents, right? Interviewers may also guide respondents to say no to the filter questions. You haven't bought any shoes, have you? Because we don't want to go through that loop again, right? So a lot of times in the literature, you see the literature suggesting that it's the respondents without real proof, and so I just want to put forth the hypothesis that it could in fact be the interviewers, or it could be both, right? So the research questions that I'm going to address today: is the underreporting that we see in these three phenomena due to burden avoidance on the part of the respondents, or is it due to an alternative explanation, such as better understanding of the task? Do interviewers also contribute to the phenomenon? That turns out to be a pretty difficult question to answer, or at least I feel like we haven't gotten a real handle on it, but I'll show you what we have learned. And then can we alter these effects? Can we change the burden or the perception of the burden and try to reduce the amount of underreporting in response to these situations? I think I'll suggest some practical tips to you that have come out of our experiments on how you can reduce these kinds of underreporting. But I also think, if we can affect these phenomena, right? If we can cause these effects to get bigger and smaller by manipulating parts of the questionnaire, that helps us to understand the mechanism of what's going on in these situations. So to address these research questions, we've conducted several experiments, maybe 5 or so, 6, both in the US and in Germany and in the Netherlands. And that's what I'm going to be presenting here today, is the results of all of these surveys that we've done. So moving on to talk specifically about screener questions. Again, these are the questions where we establish eligibility for the entire survey. You know what, I'm just going to get some water here, one moment. While I'm doing that, you can look at this slide. So to study screeners, we did 2 experiments, both in the US, one telephone and one face-to-face. And in both of these situations, we screened for a population of 35 to 55-year-olds, so adults. And in reality, they are about 45% of the US population. So that's the eligibility rate we were expecting to find in these situations. I should say the second survey, this face-to-face survey, is very new. I only got the results of this one in early August. So I'll show you what we have, but I can't say that we've really fully understood it or gotten our minds around every aspect of it. The first one, we've published a paper on the first one, so that one I've got a better handle on. So in that first survey, we did 3 experimental manipulations. Remember that the previous results suggested that respondents hide their eligibility because they want to not participate in the survey. So to get at that, we did these two manipulations. The first changes the way we word the question. So the direct method, this is the one that most surveys use in my experience. Is anyone there 35 to 55? Or are there any women there 15 to 49? Or just asking, is anyone in our target population? That's what we're calling the direct method. And that's usually what we see. Then we tried the complement method, sort of, is everyone there not 35 to 55, right? So the way that was actually phrased, is everyone there younger than 35? Is everyone there older than 55? Trying to not give away what the target population was. And then there was the full roster version, where we didn't ask about ages at all, not in that way. We just said, please tell me the age, race, sex, and ethnicity of every adult member of your household. And then we were able to determine who was in our eligible age range and asked to speak to that person, right? So that full household roster disguises the target population from the respondents. And then we manipulated the advance letter as well. One version explained exactly who we were calling for. We will be calling your household to interview people 35 to 55 for our survey. And in another version, we didn't ask specifically. We just said we will be calling your household to participate in the survey. So those are the two manipulations on the respondent side. To manipulate the interviewer incentives, we changed how they're paid. So in the US, it's very common, in fact, it's almost universal, to pay interviewers by the hour. Even face-to-face interviewers are paid by the hour. In Germany and other countries in Europe as well, I believe, interviewers are paid by the case. If I go out and I get someone to complete the interview, that's 100 euros in my pocket. And if I don't find anybody that day, then I don't get paid for the work that I did that day. We wanted to do a case-based versus hour-based payment manipulation. We could not convince anyone to let us do that. Survey organizations do not want you messing with how they pay their interviewers, right? They've got trained interviewers, they've got standards on how they pay them, and so we couldn't do that. I mean, the idea would be, in a screener situation, someone who's paid by the hour may have lower eligibility rates. So I call you up, you sound like somebody who's not going to do the interview anyways, I'll just make you ineligible and we'll hang up and end this interaction. Whereas if you're paid by the case, you have a real financial incentive to find that person eligible, complete the screener, find that person eligible, and go on and do the full survey so you make your money at the end, right? That's what we were hoping to find, but we could not do that manipulation. Instead, we did this manipulation. So all interviewers were paid hourly at the normal wage. This survey was done at the University of Michigan Survey Center. One group of interviewers got $2 for every screener that they completed, screener interview. That's just the quick interview to establish eligibility. And they got that whether the family was found to be eligible or not. All they had to do was get the screener completed. Another group of interviewers got a bonus of $5 every time they completed a full interview. So there we should see higher eligibility rates, right, because they should find people eligible, keep them on the phone, and do the full interview. And then there was a control group that didn't get any bonus at all. These interviewers were kept in different rooms so that they couldn't interact with each other, or they weren't supposedly not supposed to interact with each other. They were told they were working on different surveys. And one thing that the university made us do at the end was equalize the payments. So we had to go back to the underperforming interviewers and give them more money because the university didn't want sort of inequality there. So the results of this survey. In the first section here at the table, we see the results for the wording manipulation, the direct, complement, and roster versions of the screener. So let's talk about definitions. This is the screener completion rate, which is in the numerator the number of screeners completed, and in the denominator what's just all the cases that were fielded, right? And we see higher screener completion rates in the direct version and lower screener completion rates in the roster version. So the bold here means that this is a significant difference, and that's something that's going to be throughout this presentation. So we see a significantly higher screener completion rate in the direct version, because that's the screener that's just one question. Is anyone there 35 to 55? The roster is a bit more invasive, right? Please tell me the name, age, sex, and race of all the adults in your household. And you have to get through all those questions, and you have to convince the respondent that it's a good idea to stick around and do all those questions, right? So there's a lower screener completion rate there. But the eligibility rate, oh, that doesn't work, does it, when I point the green at the, at the screen? The eligibility rate is the number of people found eligible, the number of households found eligible divided by the number of completed screeners. And here we see a higher eligibility rate in the roster version. So when we don't tell the household who we're looking for, we get more eligible cases. In the direct version, when we just ask, is anyone there eligible, we get a lower eligibility rate. We also have a significant difference in the interview completion rate. Higher interview completion rate in the direct format than in the roster format. It seems to be if you get people to go through the roster, to complete the screener, you find them eligible, and now they have less likely to do the rest of the interview, right? They're sort of done. And then in the response rate, we also see a significant difference. But look at this yield column here on the end. So this is the number of completed interviews. Not completed screeners, not eligible screeners, but the number completed at the very end. And we see that the roster version is doing much better than the direct version. I haven't talked too much about the complement. It's sort of an odd version, and I don't think that anybody would really use that. So that's just kind of ignoring that here. But you can see it's sort of in the middle, most of these rates. Moving on to the letter, we see almost nothing. There's very little statistically significant differences in the rates by the two different versions of the letter, the one that mentioned the age group we're looking for, and the one that didn't mention the age group we're looking for. There is a statistically significant difference in the interview completion rate. We get more completed interviews when the letter mentions the target group, but nothing in the screener or the eligibility rate. And then moving on to the payment, the last part of the table here, we had the three groups, $2 bonus for screener, $5 bonus for interview, and no bonus. Here we see that the screener rates are higher when we pay interviewers to complete screeners. That makes sense, right? The main interview rate is higher when we pay interviewers to complete that main interview, the full interview. So this is a strong payment effect. I think we write in the paper, like, this is consistent with economic theory and also with common sense. We don't see any interaction of the payments with the eligibility rates, right? There's no significant difference here. So that effect that I suggested we would find, where interviewers who are paid for the main interview, the completed full interview, are not more likely to find their respondents to be eligible. I mean, there is a higher rate here than here, but it's not a statistically significant difference. That may be a bit of a power issue. We had 12 interviewers per condition here. So we had lots of cases and lots of screeners, but sort of only 12 degrees of freedom in each of these two subsets here. So it may be that another survey could find a difference here, a bigger survey. Looking in more depth at the interviewers, here every column is one of the interviewers, and there's 2 dots. So the yellow is that interviewer's screener rate, the fraction of the cases that they were assigned that they completed the screener on. And the blue square is that interviewer's eligibility rate, the percent of the screeners that they did that were found eligible. Okay? And then we have the interviewers ordered into the 3 sets, the 3 payment conditions, and within each one of those sorted by their screener rates. And so we see here, you can see what we're looking at, right? There's an higher average screener completion rate when we pay people for the screeners. The yellow dots here are sort of on average higher than the yellow dots here. We saw that result on the previous slide as well. But there's no pattern in the eligibility rates. I think if we were to run a least squares line through these blue dots, there's no pattern here. It doesn't seem to vary at all by the condition that the interviewers, or the payment condition that the interviewers were in. What we do see is a lot of variation within the 3 payment groups, right? And we see a general trend that the higher an interviewer's screener rate, the lower that interviewer's eligibility rate. We saw that in general on the previous slide, but we also see it within interviewers. So I interpret this as that there are strong differences between interviewers. Some interviewers complete a lot of screeners and get lower eligibility rates, and some interviewers complete fewer screeners with higher eligibility rates, but the payment manipulation that we did didn't drive that, or doesn't interact with it at all. Interviewers are of different types, but it's not related to the payment manipulation. Moving on to the second study we did. This one was face-to-face, also in the U.S., and this is the one that's new, and so I'm not so sure about the results here. We only did the direct and the full roster here. We didn't do the complement because it was just a little odd. And we partially interpenetrated, meaning that it was a face-to-face survey. Usually in face-to-face surveys, you have one interviewer in an area. So one interviewer in Mannheim, and one interviewer in Köln, and one interviewer in Düsseldorf. And then you can't tease apart the differences between, is that the way, you can't tease apart the area effects and the interviewer effects. If the cases in Mannheim all seem a little different, is that because they're in Mannheim, or is that because the interviewer assigned there is a little bit different, right? So we interpenetrated our design so we can separate those two things, which is not often done in face-to-face surveys. Okay, the results we see here are exactly the opposite from the telephone survey. And so more work is needed. We see in the roster version a higher screener completion rate, which is exactly what we didn't see in the previous version, right? In the roster version, I argued it was harder to complete a screener. Here, the screener completion rate is higher. The eligibility rate is lower in the roster version. So this may be a mode effect, right? It may be something to do with face-to-face and phone. We still have to dig into this. One thing I guess I kind of, I'm going to go back here for a second, I kind of brushed over. In this version, we asked the direct question, but then we also took the respondents through the full roster. So it's not exactly a replication of the telephone study. It's not a one question and done screener. We also got the full roster information. And so let's think through what that means, right? I mean, I think the respondent doesn't know. If you come up and you say, is anyone here 35 to 55? And they say, no, no, no. And then you say, wait a minute, I've got a few more questions, right? The respondent doesn't know that those additional questions are coming, right? Who knows? It's the interviewer, right? So the big difference here in doing the direct as a one question in the telephone and as a one question plus a roster in the face-to-face is we changed the interviewer incentives there. So I think that's a bit unfortunate in the design, and I'm not sure how to interpret then the results that we see here. Because we've really we've changed the interviewer incentives here from the phone survey. And so if anyone has thoughts, I would appreciate hearing them, but I'm not sure what to make of these results at this moment. So to summarize our findings on the screener interviews, I'm coming back to those 3 research questions that I showed you earlier. We do see support for the burden avoidance by the respondents. When we manipulate the wording of the question and make it easier for the respondents to make themselves ineligible, they do so, right? That was an expected result, but still something that's nice to demonstrate here. Do interviewers contribute to the phenomenon? We were able to manipulate the interviewer payment and thus the interviewer incentives, and that affected the productivity measures, the screener rate and the interview completion rate, but it didn't interact with the eligibility. We saw substantial interviewer effects in that graph with all the dots on it, but they weren't related to the payment. And so something's going on with the interviewers, but I don't think that we fully understood it here. There does seem to be this trade-off, though, between the response rate and the eligibility rate, both on the overall and at the interviewer level as well. Can we affect the misreporting? Yes, we can. In the phone situation, I think we really understand what's going on there. Asking the questions in the roster version increases eligibility, increases yield, but decreases your response rate. And that's that non-response coverage trade-off again, right? What my thinking when I see this result is we should use the roster version, certainly in the phone. We're not sure what's going on in face-to-face. My thought here is the roster version is doing well, and we should use that. I worry that other people are going to say, oh no, I don't want you decreasing my response rates, right? If you think back to that graph, the roster version had the lowest response rate, but it also had the highest coverage rate. And coverage is not something we report, right? So if you use the direct version, your response rates are going to look really high, and you're going to be able to publish high response rates in your articles, but they're just disguising a real problem where you're missing the eligible people in your target population, right? So my takeaway here is that the roster version is better because it increases eligibility or coverage of the target population, and it increases your yield. I think other people read that, not my co-authors, but like other people who read the article take it the other way and say, well, higher response rates. I'm going to go with the direct version. Okay, moving on to filter questions. Remember, these are the questions used to establish eligibility within the middle of a survey for additional follow-ups, and we can ask those in two different methods, the interleaved and the grouped, which was discussed. We did 4 surveys to study the filter questions. 2 of them were in Germany with the same set of respondents, so we did a wave 1 survey with 2,400 people, and then got about 1,400 of them again to participate in wave 2. And for wave 1, we have administrative data, as I discussed in my introduction. All right, so at EAB, we have some access to federal databases where we know people's employment histories and so on. So we can use those to verify some of the questions, some of the answers. We also worked with the LIS survey in the Netherlands. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's an ongoing web panel. They recruit a nationally representative sample of households and then follow them every month. They do a survey. So, and that's a nice survey. You can put questions on there. You can propose that they host your questions for you for free. And so we did that with some of our filter questions. And then we also did a web survey in the US. That was a convenience sample, and that's why I'm saying the response rate there is not available. Okay, in each of these 4 surveys, we experimentally manipulated or varied the interleaved grouped formats. So every respondent got the filters in either interleaved or grouped. But each survey also contained additional manipulations. The 2 surveys in Germany, in wave 1, we changed whether the follow-ups were always the same or whether they were different. So in those examples we were looking at earlier, it was always how much did those blank cost? How satisfied are you with blank? Right? The questions, the follow-up questions were identical for each kind of clothing. It's really warm in here. Could you maybe like open a window or something? Yeah, I know. It's just so warm. Thanks. So in wave 1, we manipulated whether the follow-ups were always the same or not. In wave 2, we manipulated the number of follow-ups, 2 versus 4. We did the number of follow-ups on the web as well, 2 versus 6. And in this web survey, we did something really cool where we changed how the questions looked on the screen on the web. So we looked at this graph earlier. I'm just reminding you to think back to what that is. This is the format effect, that we get more yeses to the filter questions in the group format than in the interleave format. That's what we see in this graph. And the effect really occurs later in the section. When we start out, the formats are performing the same, interleaved and grouped. But as it goes on, the number of grouped yeses divided by the number of interleaved yeses gets to be really out of whack. It's no longer 1. It's 2 or 2.5. There's 2 possible explanations for this observed phenomenon, this learning within a section by the people in the interleave format. The first I'm going to call the burden hypothesis. It could be that respondents in both conditions, they start out answering honestly, as we hope that everyone does, right? But in the interleave format, thinking back to those annoying questions about clothing purchases, right? In the interleave format, as you go on, they start to get annoyed, they find it repetitious and boring and burdensome, and they start saying no to the later questions. That's the usual explanation. That's the one I put forth in the beginning of this talk as well. So that's what we see in the literature, but nobody's really investigated whether that's true. So that's the burden hypothesis. An alternative is what we call the acquiescence hypothesis. It could be that respondents are learning how to answer these questions better in the interleave format. So it could be that respondents like to say yes. This is a known finding that you may have covered in your classes here, right? To yes-no questions, respondents like to say yes. I mean, humans just like to say yes to yes-no questions. So we could be that these filters are yes-no questions, so we start off saying yes. Did you buy pants in the last 3 months? Oh, I don't know, probably yes. Right? And then as we go on, in the interleave format, it turns out there are these follow-ups. Oh, wait a minute. How much did they cost? Oh, you know what? I think it was actually more than 3 months ago. It must have been a really long time ago because I can't remember how much they cost. So in the interleave format, you're training respondents to answer better. In the grouped format, they don't get that training, and they just acquiesce and say yes, 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 yes. Right? That hypothesis could also explain this learning effect. And so these two hypotheses have different implications for data quality. The burden hypothesis suggests that grouped is collecting better answers. In the interleave, people start lying and saying no. That's the burden hypothesis is saying, right? The acquiescence hypothesis says that the interleave people are learning, but they're getting to be better respondents. They're thinking more thoroughly and more deeply about the filter questions. And it's in the grouped format that you're getting over-reporting. They're giving you bad data in the grouped format and better data in the interleaved. So using this administrative data that we've linked into the surveys, we can distinguish between these two hypotheses. Looking at what's more common. Is it under-reporting in the interleave format as suggested by burden, or is it over-reporting in the acquiescence as suggested, over-reporting in the group format as suggested by acquiescence?
In the group format, if I say for the photo shirt and the suit, you still ask the follow-up question for all the yes is them.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so when we compare the answers to the administrative data, this is what we see. In the interleave format, now this is, I should say, this is not about clothing purchases. We don't have administrative data on clothing purchases, right? The data, the administrative data we have is about different types of employment. So these questions are, have you ever had a full-time job? Have you ever had a part-time job? Have you ever done a practicum? Have you ever participated in an Ausbildung? Things like this, some training courses, not clothing questions. But when we look at these employment questions, we see better reporting, a higher percent correct in the grouped format. We're getting better reporting in the group format. We're getting more false negatives. False negative is when you say no and you should have said yes, right? That's under-reporting. So we're getting more under-reporting in interleaved than in grouped. And we're getting a good amount of over-reporting as well in both formats, but it's not related to the format. These differences are not significant. So we see quite a bit of under-reporting and over-reporting in all the formats, but we see the pattern suggested by that burden hypothesis. Better reporting in grouped and under-reporting in interleaved. And again, this is what the literature suggested, hinted at, claimed, but didn't have proof of, and now we have that. So altogether, these three findings are strong support for the burden hypothesis. Okay, well, how can we reduce the burden of the interleave format? There may be reasons we want to use the interleave format. In the interleave format, I ask you about your pants, and then I ask you the follow-ups about those pants. Or I ask about part-time employment, and the follow-ups follow right away. If you're a respondent and you've got your mind around your part-time employment, it's probably better to ask the follow-up questions right there, right? Rather than waiting 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, now wait a minute. Way back then you said you had a part-time job. Let's talk about that, right? So for those of you who've studied kind of a cognitive model of how you answer questions, I think the interleave format is going to do better for people cognitively, right? So are there things that we can do to improve the performance of the interleave format? That's something that we're investigating with all of these studies and all those other manipulations that I told you about. Because it may not be only the data quality of the filters that you're interested in, you may be interested in the quality of the answers to the follow-ups as well, right? The previous graph or the previous table looked only at the data quality to the filters. So we compared the number of follow-up questions. This is a pretty straightforward one. In 2 different surveys, we compared 2 follow-up questions versus 4 or 6 follow-up questions. So this one here is the Wave 2 phone survey in Germany, and this one here is the LIS panel, I believe. Yeah, the LIS web survey. And we find that we get more triggering answers, more yeses to those filter questions when there are fewer follow-ups. This is all in the interleave format now, right? We're talking about how do we improve the interleave format. And so here we see that we get more yeses in interleaved when there are fewer follow-up questions. I don't think that's unexpected, but it's a nice thing to show. And then the tip here would be, you know, don't ask questions you don't need, I guess, right? We also tried varied versus monotonous follow-up items. So some of the questions, most of the questions I've shown you, with the follow-ups are always the same. So monotonous means like boring, right? That's not an English word that everyone knows. So in the monotonous condition, the follow-ups are the same for every filter. In the varied version, the follow-ups are tailored to the filter question. My favorite here, this survey was in German. This was the Wave 1 German survey. My favorite one here was about the pants. And it was, are those work pants or free time pants? I just thought that was awesome. Free time pants. But the follow-ups are very tailored to the subject, right? And they vary with each of the topics. And we see here, I haven't put the numbers up, but the varied follow-ups lead to more triggering responses. So we can reduce the burden, or at least the perception of the burden, on behalf of the respondent, and get them to give us more triggering answers in the interleave format. And then in the web survey, this is the US web survey, the convenience sample, we played with, so if you're doing a web survey, often you would use filter questions, and how do you present those to a respondent in order to avoid this underreporting phenomenon? So here's a filter question. In the past 6 months, have you purchased pajamas? These clothing questions are just very reliably generate the format effect, which is why we've used them in all these surveys, even though they're a little bit silly. But as I said, they're based on that consumer expenditure survey. They are questions that are used, or they're similar to questions that are used in real surveys. So have you purchased pajamas or a nightgown? Yes, no, or don't know. This is how the question appears before you answer it. So you get to this new screen, and this is what it looks like. If you say no, the follow-ups gray out, because you're not supposed to answer those. Right? So how does that manipulation perform? So that's here, single page, 57 versus 45. So we get more triggering responses when there's no gray out than when there is the gray out. The use of gray to indicate the filtering reduces the triggering. So if you make it very visually obvious to the respondents, you say no and all these questions disappear, right? Then they're more likely to say no. Again, it's this perception of burden. doesn't actually change how the questionnaire works. It just changes how it looks. Okay? Whereas if all the questions still stay black, then you get a higher triggering rate there. We also looked at whether the questions should be put all on one page or not. If we go back here, you can see the filter and the follow-ups are all on one page. In order for this gray out thing to work, you need them all on one page, right? But I believe, this was true a few years ago, I'm not sure if this is still true, but the best practice in web surveys is to put questions each on their own page, right? So we tried that as well. Some of you are taking a web class, and you can tell me if my knowledge is out of date here. So we compared a single page versus multi-page design. In the multi-page, it was filter, and then if you said yes, it was first follow-up, second follow-up, third, right, and so on, all on different pages. And we get much more triggering when they're all on one page than when they're page after page after page. It's like a burden of additional clicking, right? I don't want to have to click all that way. I'm going to start saying no to the filter questions. That's an interpretation that's consistent with this result. So although the usual advice is to put the questions on separate pages, in fact, I think here that's not a great idea. So what do we find for the filter questions? To sum up, we find that strong support for that burden hypothesis over the acquiescence hypothesis. We haven't found any evidence of interviewer issues here, interviewer interactions. That's probably because the interviewers are working in all of the formats, and they get very used to all of them, and they don't anticipate what kind of format is this question going to be in when they're speaking to new respondents. Yeah, so with no interviewer effects here that we can detect, although I'm interested to see if anyone has ideas on how we could get at that. And we can affect the misreporting by changing the number of filters, the monotony or the variedness of the filters, and how they're presented visually in a web survey. Okay, the last section here is on these dependent interviewing questions. Using information from a previous wave to feed forward and get information in a second wave. Here we use those two rounds of the German survey. But these are both phone surveys. These are the same surveys in which we did the filter question experiments. And we asked 13. So in the first wave, we collected the information to feed forward into the second wave, right? So the experiment is really in the second wave, where we fed information forward. Last time we spoke to you, you said this. We had 13 such questions on topics of sociodemographics, like your school leaving certificate, the number of people in your household, current employment, and income sources. So as I said, existing research has shown that is this still the case leads to underreports of change, right? Last time you said this, is that still the case? Well, existing research has not shown that. We worry about that, right? We worry that these dependent interviewing questions make it too easy for the respondents to say, oh, everything's the same, right? And we get underreports of change. So in this survey, we experimentally manipulated how these dependent interviewing questions are asked. When we last spoke to you, you said you were full-time employed, or you said your household had 5 members. And then there's several different ways you could ask the follow-up question then. Is that still the case? Yes or no? We've seen that one before. Yes, there is the easy answer to give. People like to say yes, right? It's also the answer that means I'm not going to ask you about the change. We're going to skip over that question, right? And it's going to lead to an underreporting of change generally if people say yes. So that's still question 2 often. So we changed that. So we manipulated that question and said, last time we spoke to you, you said there were 5 people in your household. Has that changed? The difference there is that the yes answer is now the one that means change, right? In the first version, yes means everything's the same, and in the second version, yes means something has changed. The third version is not a yes-no question, so we're trying to get away from that entirely. And it says, last time we spoke to you, you said X. Is that still the case, or has it changed? So you can't say yes. I mean, you could, but that doesn't make sense. You have to say it's still the case, or it's changed. There's no yes answer there, and so we're trying to get away from that acquiescence or yes saying to mess up the answers. Another version we tried is, last time we spoke to you, you said X. What is the current value? So there's no still or change there at all, right? So a little more concrete. Last time we spoke to you, you said you were full-time employed. What is your current employment status? So we call this the remind ask condition. You remind what they said last time, and then you simply ask the question again as it was in the first wave. And then the control version is this last one. There's no reminding. There's no last time we spoke to you. It's just the question again. What is your current employment status? That's the independent version, and we know from previous research that this tends to over-report change in panel surveys. But we included it as a control here. And so what do we see? Surprising results, in my opinion. So here are the 5 conditions we just went through in the same order. Is that still the case up at the top? Has that changed? Is that still the case or has it changed? And then the remind ask. Last time you said X, what about now? And then just this independent version here as well. And here is the percent of respondents reporting change. And if you look at I don't have the confidence intervals on here, although I should. These 3 are statistically identical, right? There's no statistical difference between the performance of these 3. And this really surprised me, given that yes is such a different answer in the still version and in the change version. I thought we would see different change rates in those 2. Because here, yes means no change, and here, yes means change, right? So I thought we'd see different performance. That is not what we see. The still changed is also right in line with these guys. The independent is getting a lot more change, which we expected from previous literature, previous research. That's not surprising. And this remind ask version is right in the middle. And it's statistically different than the independent and then the other 3. So it's kind of out there on its own. Maybe you can see where this is going, right? We don't have the administrative records for these questions yet, but we will for most of them. And then I can put a line on this graph saying, here's the true value, right? And then we'll know which one of these versions is really the best one to be using, at least in this telephone survey in Germany, with all the caveats, right? But we're in a unique position here at EAB to do this kind of research, and so I'm excited about that. That will happen in February or so. So stay tuned. A little behind in my notes here, but okay. And then also in this survey, we tried to get at the mechanisms of reporting. So we asked a bunch of questions to try to explain how people are answering these dependent interviewing questions. We asked 4 sets of contradictory statements. So 4 pairs of questions that were contradictory. And we judged whether people agreed to contradictory things. So someone who acquiesces a lot is going to say yes to one question and to its opposite, and then get a score of 1 for that pair, right? So you can agree to up to 4 of these pairs, and you can have an acquiescence score of up to 4. Most people, as you can see by the 0 there, did not agree to these contradictory statements. So they have a 0 for the acquiescence score. We're trying to figure out here who is a yes sayer, who likes to say yes and who doesn't, right? There's another question about distraction. I love this question. It was a list of 17 activities that asking which of these have you also been doing while we've been interviewing you. It was only a 20-minute interview. You think people could concentrate for 20 minutes, but no. Only 1 person said they did nothing else. So any ideas you had about having your respondents' full attention, just throw those away. This was a phone survey. In person, it probably would be different, right? But most people did one other thing, and then some people did a lot of other things, right? There were things like watching TV, watching the kids, making dinner. One of them was like repairing my car. This question came from Paul Lavrakis, who's like a well-known survey methodologist in the US. He's used this question a lot. So I recoded this to 1 and more than 1. And then that 0 person, I figured, probably lied, and I just put it in. So it's a measure of distraction. The idea here being that maybe somebody who's not listening real well is going to answer these questions differently. Wait, last time I said what? I didn't hear you, you know. We had 3 questions measuring someone's cognitive effort. If you know that book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, they're in that book, although the questions come from Frederick. We can maybe talk about what these questions actually are, but a score of 0 means that somebody always picked the easy answer, which is wrong, right? So these are people who are thinking fast. There's an easy answer, an obvious answer, but it's the wrong answer. And then you can have a score of 1, 2, or 3, indicating how many of the questions you got right. You didn't go with the first thing that came to mind. You thought a little more deeply and a little more slowly about the question and found the right answer. Almost nobody got 3, but some people got 1 or 2. And we had these questions on these questions on word recall, where we read a list of nouns, butter, arm, king, and then asked people to repeat them back. So you could get a score of 10 there. Some people got 10, they remembered all of them, but some people refused to play and didn't get any of them, right? But most people were in the middle. And then a -7. So the question here was, starting with 100, please subtract 7. What number do you get? Right? 93. Okay, please subtract 7 from that number. What do you get? And it went down 5 times. So this is a measure of like how well people can sort of conceptualize things in their head and hold numbers in their heads and do subtraction, right? And we did allow for someone to say maybe 95 and then continue to get things right. These 5 scores measure different things. They're not correlated with each other. These are 5 different measures of attitudes, cognitive skills, interest in the question, all sorts of things. So here we want to look at whether these 5 scores, which are shown in the columns here, correlate with the differences in the reporting styles. So the independent answer is the reference category here, and I'm comparing it to the still answer. So a 1 here means somebody was in the still condition versus the independent condition. All the other conditions are thrown away. I'm just looking at still versus independent. And this is the score on acquiescence, 0 to 4. How much of an acquiescer are you? Right? And this is the interaction of those two. So we see that still gets less change than independent. We saw that in the graph with the dots as well, the 5 dots. The still version always gets fewer changes than the independent version. The stars here indicate that all of those numbers are significant. The scores are not related. None of these scores, except for the word recall, are related to change reports. And none of the interactions, except for word recall, are related to the change reports. We were hoping that we had designed good scores here, right? And we could explain the different change reports in still and independent formats. That turns out not to be the case. Our acquiescence measure does not measure differences in these versions. The only thing that works is this recall score. How many of the 10 nouns that people were given could they remember and repeat back? Those who remembered more words reported less change in the independent format and more change in the still format. And so I think this is not related to memory. This is not a memory effect, right? Because remembering words for 10 seconds, that's not related to whether you remember what your job was last year or you remember the number of people in your household. I think it has to do with like the cognitive processing of the question. Can you hold the question in your head long enough to think through what the answer is? I suspect that's what's going on here with the recall test that we've done. But I'm happy to get ideas on that. So to sum up the findings on dependent interviewing questions, the color is off on this slide. Oops. Underreporting is not due to acquiescence or other kinds of measures that we had expected. It is related to your ability to recall words and perhaps to hold words in the memory. So I don't think we have strong support for burden avoidance on the part of the respondents in this phenomena, in this relation. In this one of the 3 types of measurement error, I don't think we have strong support for that burden hypothesis. We also haven't been able to look at the contribution of interviewers yet to this phenomenon. But we can affect, we have a lot of ability to affect the misreporting here. We don't see any difference in those 3 dependent interviewing formats. So I think you're free to use any of those that you want, the still, the changed, and the still changed, and to mix them up if you want to make your questionnaire maybe more interesting or lively, right? But I'm pretty excited about this remind, ask version. It may be a middle way. If independent gets too much change, and the other 3 get too little change, that remind, ask might be a middle option. And I hope that the truth line goes right through that dot, but we'll see. So that's what we're going to do next year, early next year, when the data is available. To sum up overall, I think we have evidence for that motivated underreporting or burden hypothesis, certainly for the screeners and for the filters, over any sort of sense of acquiescence or better responding. It does look like respondents in those 2 situations are manipulating their answers to try to reduce the burden of the questionnaire. Practically, I think for screeners, I suggest using that roster version, at least in the phone. For the filters, use the group version when you can, if it's not a cognitively difficult situation where that would be a little weird. And then vary the follow-ups, the number of follow-ups. And in the DI format, in the DI questions, the format of the question seems not to have a strong effect there, but I think those are preliminary results, and we'll get back to that. One caveat to all this work, if you were watching carefully, the response rates in none of these surveys are very high. Sometimes the panel surveys, I reported high response rates, but that's just one wave to the next, right? So we don't know anything about the responding behavior of those who didn't respond. Right? And so there's a whole class of people who didn't participate in our surveys at all, and they may be very different. And I can't say anything about that. Here are the publications that we have coming out of this project. The first on the screeners, as I said, has been published. The second is under review. That's on the burden versus acquiescence hypothesis and filter questions. Then these 2 are in preparation. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions or suggestions or complaints.
Let me first thank you for a very insightful talk.
Thanks.
Because I think there's lots of practical suggestions coming out of that, and it was very varied, and I think most surveys deal with some of those issues, maybe not all of them at the same time, hopefully. So, Steve.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you. Maybe I'll sit down.
Your results fit into this, cross-cultural way that really interesting one discussion may not have a similar result. But I was also curious about whether you found different results across the US, Netherlands, and Japan.
We did not. So the filter question is the one where the filter topic is the one where we've done all 3 of those countries, and the results are very similar across all of the countries as far as we can tell. So that interleave versus group finding was constant across all those cultures. Now those cultures are not as different as, they're rather similar. So I'm sorry, I can't say anything about that at this point. Do you have hypotheses that other cultures would be find things less burdensome?
Well, actually, I was thinking of a possible answer to this, of why you didn't find any differences between cross-cultural psychology. There is this theory that these kind of cultures, US and especially Western Europe, cluster together within the independent psychology. Whereas the more Eastern countries, the Asian communities, for instance, China, Japan, Korea, and so on, would be clustered together with the collectivist culture. So I guess that would be a good way to start with. And you mentioned Maryland University. Maryland is a very known for psychology.
Michelle
Gelfand.
Gelfand, okay.
So, yeah, I guess that would really improve the argument that
Yeah, I like that. Thank you very much.
Okay, further questions? Just a remark, it would be nice if we could repeat the questions in front here so the people who are following us online can hear them as well, because it was now a bit too long to repeat, I think, because the microphone is here and we cannot carry it on. Any further questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Nobody else goes
Go ahead.
I've got a follow-up question on the intellect versus group form. Because always practice of surveys, you have to make trade-offs. And the intellect format maybe has a negative effect in terms of immediate negative effect in terms of shortening the interview. But I wonder, the group format looks to me in a panel grade level even more repetitive. At least if there are long blocks of follow-up questions, then you get like tons of them.
So we have a big battery of filter questions in the group format in wave 1, and then that would work well in wave 1, but then in wave 2 they would remember, I know what happened last time.
Exactly. So you have to be very careful, I guess, about that, and it would be a nice follow-up also for methodology.
Yeah, right. In the LIS web survey, this is the Netherlands web survey where you can put questions on. We did do it in 2 consecutive months, and we put our most annoying questions on there, like have you purchased cat food and have you purchased wine or beer or cigarettes. I mean, these kind of purchase questions with follow-ups, and we did not see wave over wave effects. I mean, we see that people who purchase things in one wave purchase them the next wave. And this is a monthly survey, so they have to be sort of very regular purchases. But we didn't see, I couldn't detect any panel conditioning there that they remembered from the previous wave.
I wasn't thinking on panel conditioning, but on your research, so panel nutrition.
Oh, okay. In the LIS survey, the other thing too, I should say, it may be that these are people who've been in this panel for 5 years, so they, special people.
Highly experienced, and they are people who just like to filling in surveys, that seems, right?
Yeah, I think they get
preference for surveys.
Yeah.
I have one more question, because you said, well, you're still working on quite a lot of this is ongoing work, really, in preparation, and you will have more results in early 2014 when the administrative data become available. How do we find out? I will certainly be, so that's joint work with Annette Yekla, and we will be at the APOR conference, which is in Anaheim, California in May. There's a panel data methods workshop in Ann Arbor right after APOR, also in May. We will be at both of those conferences with the results.